Hi everyone. So this is Morgan. Here I am with your Chapter 1 content for Gen Ed 1407. And I'm really just going to jump right into everything. But before I do that, I just want to quickly show you where you can find everything. Of course, signing on to your DC Connect page, this is what it's going to look like. You can go to Content, Chapter 1, and find all the information and all the resources that you need to follow along with this chapter. So you can go ahead and read Chapter 1 in your Pearson ebook. It will look something like this. Don't forget you can click on stuff to find out more about it. So the e-text is really cool and handy and is just a different version of the physical textbook. So either one is fine, but just so you know, it's all there for you. You can also find the PowerPoint, which I'm going to be showing in this screencast lecture. So if you don't want to listen to the sound of my voice, you can totally go ahead and look over that PowerPoint, but hopefully I'm going to be giving you some more useful information in the screencast lecture as well. Then you can find some of your other mission tasks, such as the scavenger hunt, which you're going to put in the assignments folder, which will release the Chapter 1 game. Completing that will release the mission task that will be graded for about 2%. It's the social theory article and its associated quiz. Very easy, very straightforward. Completing that will release your Chapter 1 5% quiz on all of the Chapter 1 content. You'll have a checklist that will look something like this, but not exactly because, as you know, I'm the teacher. So if you have any questions about how any of that works, feel free to let me know. It will take a little bit of getting used to, so don't be afraid to feel unsure and just clarify anything that you need with me. And I'm sure you'll get the hang of it super quickly. All right, so again, that's just touching base on DC Connect, and now I'm just going to jump right back into our PowerPoint. We have worked through all the sort of admin stuff in our first class that kind of tells you more about how the class is set up and whatnot. So I'm going to let you peruse that at your leisure by just looking at the PowerPoint file. But for our intents and purposes at this very moment, I am just going to go ahead and load up the Chapter 1 content there for you. So we briefly touched on this definition of sociology in our first lecture together. Sociology being a science guided by the basic understanding that our lives are affected not only by our individual characteristics, but by our place in the social world. So sociology overall focuses on social relationships, looking at how others influence our behavior, how major social institutions like the government, religion, the economy, the family, how they affect us, and how we ourselves affect other individuals, groups, and even organizations. So you've got a little question on the screen here that says, if we are governed by social forces, where does free will come in? Thoughts? And it's really prompted by this little think sociologically box on the bottom of page 7. And I'm going to let you pause this video right now and go and read that little box. So now that you've read it, you'll have started thinking about this sort of sliding scale of philosophy between the world being entirely based on our free will on one end of the spectrum and entirely based on determinism or social forces that we have no control over on the other end of the spectrum. And what you're going to be learning in these first few weeks and perhaps throughout the semester is this is something that will never fully work out, but that's something that can help us really understand how these things work together to sort of create our entire social world. So the next thing that I want to draw your attention to at the beginning of Chapter 1 is this analogy that they give us about the sociology of driving, which, of course, there is no sociology of driving specifically, but it's a metaphor. So it's actually back on page 5, and I'm going to allow you to pause this video right now and go ahead and read the Make Connections box on the sociology of driving. So now that you've read that, again, you'll sort of be thinking about this same philosophy. How do we understand why we do the things we do? Sociology sort of asks us, where did we learn all of the social norms that we know? how to behave, where to sit, what to do, how to talk to people. Just in the same way that when we drive, it's sort of unconscious if you're a good driver, or maybe not. Anyways, I'm going to show you a little video that's going to get you sort of thinking more about the things that we take for granted, that we do without thinking in our social world.
Chapter 1. The Sociological Imagination. An Introduction. Paradox. A successful sociologist makes the familiar strange. Sociology is the study of human society and its social structures and dynamics. Or, as C. Wright Mills famously put it, sociology lies at the intersection of history and biography. Sociological thinking is about making the familiar strange. It requires a different way of seeing things, challenging conventional wisdom, and thinking critically about the social world around you. Its object of focus, in this regard, is what seems natural but in fact isn't. For example, we tend to think of a quote-unquote normal family as made up of a working dad, a mom, and kids. However, this quote traditional family was dominant only for a couple decades after World War II. Throughout history, families have come in all shapes and sizes. For instance, among the Na people in southern China, children are raised by their uncles rather than their fathers. Or take school. Why go to college? To educate yourself? Well, if that's the case, why not just go to your local library and read those same books for free? Or maybe you are in college to land a better job. People with college degrees tend to earn more money, are happier, and divorce less, right? But what about college dropouts like Mark Zuckerberg and Bill Gates, who, convinced of their ability, were able to achieve success in their own way? Just because college graduates tend to earn more doesn't mean that college caused that to be the case. It could be that people who go to college also tend to be advantaged in other ways, and that college doesn't really make a difference at all. What about race? Feels pretty natural, right? But is race real? Of course, race is a real social distinction, and people around the world make distinctions between us and them on the basis of race. In Central Africa, a jagged racial line was drawn between the Hutus and the Tutsis. Anyone with more than 10 cows or a long nose was considered Tutsi. Imagine that, race based on cows or noses. Even though genetic evidence shows the Hutus and Tutsis originated from the same Bantu peoples, this has been a very sad story, resulting in genocide of about 100,000 Hutus in Burundi in 1972 and 800,000 mostly Tutsi Rwandans in 1994. The bottom line is that things may not always be as they appear once you put on your sociological lenses. Just be sure not to trip while you're wearing them.
All right, so things may not always be as they appear once you put on your sociological lenses. So, this sense of making the familiar strange is also what sociologist Peter Berger calls debunking. This is the practice of looking beyond the surface or obvious explanation and seeking out deeper explanations. So, that's something that you're learning about right off the bat in this Chapter 1 content. That throughout the semester, we'll be talking about issues that might seem like common sense to you, that might seem very, very familiar to you. Take, for example, the family. But when we look at things in a sociological or an academic way, we need to look at these issues as an outsider might, or maybe as an alien looking down on Earth might. That will illuminate for us the things that we take for granted and that we think we don't do or that we don't see. So this is a really good practice to get in the habit of looking at things that are familiar and trying to make them seem strange. So I think I sort of reminded you of this in our first class together as well, but sociology isn't just common sense. And again, this reiteration about debunking and making the familiar strange also reinforces that as well. Sociologists do not accept knowledge simply because everyone believes it to be true. Findings are tested by researchers, analyzed in relation to other data, and evaluated with sociological theory. This is what makes sociology a social science, as opposed to a natural science like biology or physics or astronomy. The social sciences allow us to have reliable social facts that are tested through verifiable research methods and that are peer-reviewed, published in journals, etc., and allow us to use this information in order to make our world sort of a better place. And keep this in mind when you're completing your assignments in this class as well. You can't just include a bunch of information in your assignments because you think it's true. You got to go out, do your research, make sure it's good quality data in order to be able to incorporate it into your arguments. So the first thing that any sociology class will ask you to do is to develop what we call a sociological imagination. So American sociologist C. Wright Mills asserted that people must understand how outside forces contribute to their own individual situations. Developing this skill helps us to understand our place in a complex world. Essentially, the sociological imagination is being able to link our own individual problems to greater social issues and understand how those things sort of are connected. On the screen here, you're seeing this basically phrased in a bunch of different ways. So this is the ability to see how social forces influence the lives of individual, again, linking that social and that individual. An awareness of the relationship between the individual and wider society. And the ability to view our society as an outsider might, rather than relying on our own individual perspective, which is shaped by our cultural biases. So this sociological imagination really, again, sets us out this semester with the reminder that, yes, we are individuals, but we're also connected to a whole bunch of stuff by way of being a member of society. So as you're seeing again here on the screen, the example of Durkheim and suicide was the real first, scientifically valid sociological data that we sort of had on this issue back in the day. And if you get to know me throughout the semester, you know that I hate the phrase back in the day. But sometimes I do employ it. You're going to read more about Durkheim and his theory on suicide on page 7. So you can pause this lecture right now, head over to page 7 in your textbook, and read about Emile Durkheim's theory on suicide. All right, you're back. So this is super interesting stuff, and this is one of the first times that a researcher or a scholar went out and actually tried to compile some statistics on a social issue. So that was pretty cool, and it gave us sort of this classic example of the sociological imagination. Suicide being an issue that we consider to be so individually based, and of course, in a lot of ways it is. But Durkheim was actually able to remind us that it's really connected to our environment and that we can actually look at some of the identities or some of the qualities of people who take their own lives and allow ourselves to sort of understand the social context of those things in order to better understand why they happen. So he was able to connect the act of suicide to people's religion, as you read about in that section. So Protestants being more likely than Catholics to commit suicide, unmarried people being more likely than married people to commit suicide, and of course those things have social explanations. So again, if you haven't read that little section, flip over there, read it. It's good stuff, and that's an example we'll talk about throughout the semester, so make sure that you're aware of it. If we were in class together, I'd have you do this little activity. Basically, I'd have you brainstorm as a class the 10 most pressing social issues facing Canadians. So you can make some notes or you can just get thinking about what you think those things might be. And then I would break you up into groups and have each of the groups describe how one of these social issues might affect one specific individual like Bob or Sue. And then also give me another sentence on how this issue would affect an entire population. So you're seeing an example here on the screen. For example, maybe one of our most pressing social issues is childcare. Sue pays over half of her paycheck to pay for daycare. That is a very, troubling issue for Sue as an individual. On the other hand, there's lots of conclusions we could come to about childcare as a public issue. For example, we have lots of laws regarding childcare, legislation regarding subsidization, etc. Some other things we could talk about are the gender role trends in employment, social assistance, and how those things relate to childcare. The list is really endless. As long as you're able to sort of get thinking about it, that's all you really need to do in this section. And I have a little video about the sociological imagination that I'm going to show you right now.
We all have imagination. It lets us be creative and envision life in a new way. But did you know that there is something called the sociological imagination? In sociology, to understand one's own self, we must understand the relationship between self and society. The concept of the sociological imagination was presented in 1959 by C. Wright Mills in his famous book of the same title, where he states the sociological imagination enables us to grasp history and biography and the relations between the two within society. That is its task and its promise. The concept is to understand the distinction between a person's troubles and public issues. At what point does something such as unemployment or trouble finding a job shift from being a personal problem to a public issue? If one person is unemployed, that is a personal problem. If 1 million out of 10 million people cannot find employment, that is a public issue. According to Mills, there is an intricate relationship between the individual and society. Whatever a person does is not just because it is of their own choice or personal preference. A behavior as simple as exercise can be looked at from multiple perspectives. For example, exercise can provide health benefits such as lowering blood pressure, maintaining a healthy weight, or send endorphins to help alleviate stress. It can be a social activity such as taking a walk with a group of friends or playing on a sports team. It can increase productivity at work and benefit the company. And it can inspire communities to take action by building walking, biking, and running trails. So, while exercise benefits the individual, it also has a larger purpose in the social world. A person benefits from being surrounded by a community that encourages exercise and makes it easier for a person to do so, but it can also have the opposite effect if a person is surrounded by a community that does not emphasize exercise. Practically any personal behavior can be looked at with a sociological imagination. Let's take this and apply it to the very public issue of obesity in the United States. Or is it a personal trouble? Tough question. Let's figure it out. From the personal perspective, we all need to eat to live, and there are many reasons other than necessity that we gather around food. Celebrations such as birthdays, weddings, funerals, job promotions, and holidays, or just socializing with friends, often involves food. What we eat and how much we eat is within our personal control. Or is it? Let's say a person belongs to a family that often gets together for large gatherings. At these gatherings, there are often lots of burgers, chips, cookies, and desserts. Choices are limited for low fat or healthy options. After eating, the family gathers around a fire, and not much is done in the way of activities such as walking, running, or even a family friendly game of football. Over time, one realizes that these gatherings are contributing to their growing waistline. Well, we could say that this is a personal trouble. That person is making a conscious choice on what they put into their body and are in control of what they eat. While this may be true to some extent, is it all within a person's control? Our behavior is influenced by others, and in cases such as family gatherings, how might the family react if one chooses not to eat what others are eating? Social acceptance is important, even among our family. We also tend to like similar foods of the people around us. So we could say that we all make personal choices and are responsible for our own behavior, but what we eat and how we spend our time does not happen in a vacuum. Not that we blame family for choices, but that choices are influenced by the people around us. Let's take this a step further and ask ourselves what else may influence a person becoming obese. And when does a personal problem turn into a larger social issue? According to the Center for Disease Control, approximately 35% of the United States adult population is considered obese. That percentage bumps up to 69% when we consider all adults who are also overweight. Social structures that contribute to obesity include food deserts, which are areas of the United States that do not have access to healthy, whole, and fresh foods and can be found in both urban and rural areas. These are places where it is difficult to grow healthy food locally, and there is little to no access to local markets that would carry such items. Then there are government subsidies. Research shows that less than 1% of subsidies by the United States government goes towards the production of fresh fruits and vegetables, while the majority of the subsidies are given for meat, dairy, and grain production. This means that prices of healthy foods are significantly more expensive than the prices of unhealthy foods. We are also biologically driven to get the biggest energy bang for our buck. So if we have $5 in our pockets and are hungry, we are more likely going to purchase $5 in fast food rather than $5 for a bag of apples. While these are not the only social structures that contribute to obesity as a social problem, they give a clear picture of how society contributes to this. And of course, this creates more social issues. Currently, we spend approximately $147 billion on illnesses and diseases related to obesity. This creates even more issues when the cost of health care and health insurance increases because of obesity-related illness and disease. So we can say that society influences a person's behavior, and that person's behavior contributes to a social issue. What is another issue that you have typically described as a personal trouble that also has social factors that contribute to it? How do social structures such as government, economy, education, and religion contribute to social problems? And how does the sociological imagination help us examine human behavior?
All right, so now that you're an expert on the sociological imagination, we're going to move on to the 4 sociological perspectives. And I very briefly introduced you to them in our first class. If you've taken any type of anthropopsych soc before, you might have heard of some of these. And if not, don't worry, I'm going to really spell it out for you and give you all the information that you need to know about functionalism, conflict theory, symbolic interactionism, and feminist theory, because we're going to carry them with us throughout the semester. So never be afraid to refer back to this video or to refer back to chapter 1 throughout the term. Just as a reminder, it's always there for you because we're going to be using all 4 of these philosophies as we go throughout the term. So what I'm going to do is basically describe all 4 of them. First, by asking a discussion question that'll sort of get you thinking about what it is. I'm going to define the theory for you and gives you some keywords, as well as tell you its strengths and weaknesses. And I'm also going to apply each of the 4 perspectives to the same issue so that you can see that they would look at things differently, but we can use them all to look at pretty much any issue that there is. And that issue is going to be poverty. So here we go. Oh, before we do, let me just remind you that each of these perspectives can be either micro-sociological or macro-sociological. Again, which I told you about in our first class. Micro meaning small, macro meaning large, which just sort of indicates its emphasis. This chart is also repeated on page 9 of your book, which again is really good to refer back to when you're doing an analysis from any one of the perspectives, whether it be in your final term paper or anything else throughout the term. These could be really good prompt questions to sort of remind you what way each of these issues would be looking at a social issue. And again, you can sort of pause here and read through them. Again, don't forget, we've got our chapter summary linked in the additional resources section of the chapter 1 content module. So you've got your mission tasks, and then underneath that, you'll have the additional resources. So you have chapter summary, flashcards, practice quiz, all that stuff is there for you. Definitely take advantage of it. And then here, you're seeing the chapter summary in the for each of the 4 sociological perspectives. Again, if you want to pause this here to read those over, go for it. All right, now we're really getting into what I promised this time. Okay, so here would be a discussion question that if we were to be in class together, I would ask you and you would tell me what you think about it. The question is, what is the function of education in society? And you guys might tell me stuff like, you know, we have an education so that we can learn how to do stuff and get jobs. It gives us a whole bunch of knowledge so that we can be good employees, we can be productive citizens. You might also tell me things like how it teaches us cultural values like manners and citizenship. You might also tell me how it babysits kids while their parents are at work. You might also tell me how school can set kids up for success or failure, depending on whether it's a quote unquote good school or a bad school, or what the predominant sort of class makeup is of that school. You might also tell me more about how schools set children up for success or lack of success due to the different labels that they put on kids and their behaviors. So there's lots of different functions of education in society. And something that might analyze that is the functionalist perspective. The functionalist perspective is macro in analysis, so it's going to be looking at bigger social structures rather than individuals. And the functionalist perspective sees society as a system of interrelated parts. So the functionalist perspective wants to know how things function best. Just like an organism where all the different parts have their certain jobs that they do, and if one is out of whack, the rest is going to get messed up too. That's how the functionalist perspective looks at society. It wants to know what's working and what's not working, and how we can really just maintain the most stability that we can. The functionalist perspective is always going to be looking at social institutions because of this. Because social institutions are the things that fulfill a lot of the functions for us in our social lives. So it says on your screen, what are these? Social institutions are things like the family, the economy, the government, jobs. What are some other social institutions? There's quite a bit of a list that, again, is sort of structured around a lot of the big ways that we organize life and how we get stuff done and how we fulfill our needs. And all these things sort of work together to ensure social stability. So these keywords I think are important because, again, if you're asked to sort of come up with an analysis from a functionalist perspective and you're not sure where to start, these keywords can get you started. So some of the keywords that I've picked out for the functionalist perspective are stability, function and dysfunction, consensus, predictability, order. So there you go. So the example of functionalism and how functionalism would look at the issue of poverty starts like this. So a functionalist would look at how the social institutions such as the economy and government may contribute to poverty. So it's as simple as that. Functionalists suggest that society works as an interrelated system, and if we want to look at the causes of poverty, we need to look at the entire social structure. Different social institutions may contribute to poverty, like changes in the economy that may result in many people either losing their jobs or working for low wages. This can cause them to become poor. If the education system fails to give people the knowledge and skills necessary to get high-paying jobs, more people will become poor. If the government makes changes to the social support system, such as employment insurance, even more people are at risk of experiencing poverty. So it's good to look at the whole picture. Within each of the 4 sociological perspectives, you're also going to be getting some key sort of developmental highlights throughout the life course of sociology as a discipline. So within the functionalist perspective, you're getting a little bit of a breakdown on Auguste Comte, Herbert Spencer, Emile Durkheim, Talcott Parsons, and Robert Merton. You don't need to become an expert on any one of these theorists. You don't need to know their birth date and death dates. Just sort of pick out what the key terms are in each of their write-ups. So again, make sure you're reading the chapter, maybe highlight their key terms. And of course, I'm going to give you sort of the summary of each of them here. So Auguste Comte is important, and he actually coined the term sociology. So he said that sociology could be used to study social laws, which he thought were statements that we could make about our social lives. And he thought that we could do this through social statistics and social dynamics. So he called these things social statistics. So statistic meaning static, so facts or principles that we can hold constant about society, as well as social dynamics, dynamic being things that move and change. So he also wanted to know how society would change over time. So again, Comte He was one of the first sort of people to start thinking about some of these things, and that's why he's important. Herbert Spencer, he took the idea of Darwinism, which is, as you know, survival of the fittest, and applied it to society. So using Darwin's theory of natural selection, or Darwinism, he said that some societies were, quote unquote, more fit than others because they adapt better to changes in the environment. He said the strongest societies would survive and the weakest ones would become extinct. Durkheim, as I previously mentioned, he's a guy that's going to come up throughout the semester, so make sure that you know who he is. His name's Emile, not Emily. And again, he was sort of a functionalist in the sense that he viewed society as an organism. So in modern societies, Durkheim saw the traditional basis of solidarity, in other words, the element that keep people together. He thought this was being eroded. So the consequences of having a more complicated division of labor, or who does what in a society, was really of interest to him. He suggested that specialized labor in industrial societies leads to anomie, which is the loss of direction felt in a society when social control of individual behavior sort of becomes ineffective. In other words, we start to feel lost the more complicated society gets, which increases the likelihood of alienation, loneliness, isolation, and social deviance. So again, his study of suicide really correlates to this because he just wanted to know what was going to keep us together, what was going to keep society functioning, and if it wasn't, why? And again, he was one of the first people to ask this, so he was an important guy in that sense. Our next one is Talcott Parsons. He, again, a functionalist. His little picture here is the wheel. If one part of society fails to work, the whole system suffers. So he attempted grand theories to connect all aspects of society. And he used the metaphor of society being like a bike wheel, having interconnected parts. When it's balanced, it keeps on spinning. And when it has inertia or when it has momentum, that's good, and society will keep changing. And when we need change, sometimes it's sort of hard to build that inertia or momentum. So he was just sort of theorizing about physics and its relationship to how we could metaphorically think of society. Merton, Robert Merton, he said that our social institutions like family, religion, work, the economy, all have manifest and latent functions. So a manifest function is one that is obvious and intended, and latent functions are ones that are less obvious. So going back to our example about education, a manifest function or an obvious function of education is to transmit knowledge, but a latent or an unintended consequence of education is to socialize children to get along with each other, to learn friendship and cooperation. It's not necessarily written out in the curriculum, but it sure is a side effect of going to school. Of course, each of our theories are going to have weaknesses. Some of the weaknesses of functionalism are that it spends too much time talking about what keeps society balanced and brings, or sort of has a lack of understanding about what brings about change. Functionalism, as you might have imagined already, is accused of supporting the status quo, even when it's harmful. It's not necessarily going to call out something when it's unfair. That is for our next theory. All right, question to you. What was the Occupy movement? Who were the 99% and who were the 1%? I'm not sure if you guys will remember this. It was probably 5 or 6 years ago now, but it was like Occupy Wall Street, Occupy Bay Street. Protesters were going out to the financial districts of major cities around the world and protesting gigantic wealth inequality. The 99% being all of us who share a small portion of the world's wealth, and the 1% being a small portion of the world's people sharing the bulk of its wealth. So really they wanted to draw attention to income inequality and all of the plethora of issues that come along with it. Now, the theory that would be most interested in this would be the conflict perspective, and these protesters were working from the conflict perspective. Again, as I told you in class, the conflict perspective is macro. It's looking at how social structures and how social groups end up in conflict with each other, not interpersonal conflict. I repeat, not interpersonal conflict. So their emphasis is going to be on how power and resources are unequally distributed in society, and how the power elite are always making rules and laws that benefit them but apply to those below them. So this really doesn't seem fair, does it? The conflict perspective really was expanding a lot on Karl Marx's work, which I'm going to talk about more in a second. And conflict theorists assert that social order can't be fully understood apart from a consideration of how the status quo is maintained and who benefits and who suffers from an existing system. It suggests that a pyramid structure of power and wealth exists in society, with the elite at the top of the pyramid who determine the rules for those below them. I love the conflict theory because, as someone who's interested in social justice, it's really helpful in illuminating imbalances of power and how we can help people who don't have it. So some of our key words here are tension and struggle, of course, between groups and not between individuals, inequality, capitalism, competition for resources, coercion. Again, the list kind of goes on, but just to give you a bit of an idea. So, how might the conflict perspective view poverty? Conflict theorists focus on social classes and the differences in wealth, power, and prestige. They believe that the upper class controls society's wealth and resources and exploits the lower class. If the upper class shared its wealth, conflict theorists argue, then poverty would be cut down dramatically. Some conflict theorists take a wider view of inequality. They would look at inequalities not just between classes, but between different social groups. They would look at how individuals in some social groups, such as certain ethnicities, are more likely to become poor, and why. As you'll find out, this comes down to historical discrimination, etc. But getting a little ahead of myself here, jumping back into our theorists. All right, so Karl Marx, he is like the poster boy for conflict theory. If you know anything about Karl Marx, you'll know that his ideas are the basis of the communist philosophy. He wrote a little book called The Communist Manifesto. Have it if anybody would like to borrow it. But it's super, super interesting. And just because that old saying that communism, sounds good in theory but doesn't, work in reality, while that might be true, these ideas really form the basis of a lot, again, of social justice sort of thoughts and a lot of critique of drastic wealth and power imbalances in society. Okay, so Karl Marx said that the bourgeoisie control the means of production. At his time, and you can see during his lifetime, this was when the Industrial Revolution was really taking hold. We were starting to have a lot more machinery, factories, mass production, etc. And of course, this was radically changing the world. You probably can't even imagine what that would have been like, but try and put yourself back a couple hundred years in time. This was really sort of a revolutionary period. So there were people who owned the factories, who owned the land, who were making a bunch of money, and they had the proletariat, or the workers, sell their labor for wages in an unending cycle of earning and spending. Because the workers were only making enough to sort of put food on the table or a roof over their heads, and they were never really getting ahead. Again, this is an age-old struggle that we still see today. That's why, again, these ideas are still so relevant. So Marx theorized that once these workers realized what the heck was going on, they would develop class consciousness. So they would start to realize that they were being exploited, that they were never going to be released from this unending cycle. So Marx thought that they should overthrow this capitalist type of a system and move towards more of a socialist or a communist type of class or social structure. So again, these ideas are super, super important. He thought that equal wealth would equal peace. We now know that that's not true, but again, important to be aware of. Some of our other important conflict theorists would be W.E.B. Du Bois. And why he was really important was because he was one of the first people to investigate and theorize about race. So he thought that capitalism and colonialism led to unequal treatment of Black Americans. So he focused on the lives of African Americans and revealed a whole bunch of different social processes that contributed to the maintenance of racial separation, which extended beyond material differences to include social separation, which he referred to the color line or double consciousness. So in one world, African Americans were equal, and in another, they were second-class citizens. He explained that history was influential over the present, slavery and capitalism, and that the US and Europe's greed was the cause of war and poverty throughout the world. Even though he was one of the first people to sociologically study race in this way, he came to believe that African Americans and whites would never be equal, and he moved to Africa. So his contribution is super important in the sense that still such a big issue today, one of the first people to sort of socially and academically research the impact of race. Ralph Dahrendorf, he was one of the first people to come out and say, all right, look, we have, a strong idea of Marx's two-class system, but it's not really relevant to the 20th century anymore. And we need to consider that other social factors also sort of divide people into groups. He thought that Marx's work didn't fit any longer in this new post-capitalist society. So instead of focusing only on property ownership as the definitive social distinction, he recognized that other social factors divide people into groups. Essentially, he kick-started Marx's theory into something that modern sociologists could adapt and continue to be inspired by, which is super important. Of course, some may say that the conflict theory has weaknesses. I like to think it doesn't, but some may say it's too radical. Many conflict theorists are also activists because, again, these are people who have ideas about social justice in their minds, and a lot of people might accuse them of lacking scientific objectivity or of being biased towards certain issues. So those are some of the quote-unquote weaknesses. All right, next question. What is a stigma, and how might you know that you have one? So a stigma is sort of a negative connotation or an idea that's attached to a behavior or an identity. We often think of it associated with the concept of mental illness, but it's not strictly relegated to that concept. It could be a criminal sort of identity or something that you perceive about yourself to be negative. And how might you know you have one? You might know you have a stigma because maybe through social interaction you picked up on cues that other people give you or that you give others through communication, verbal and nonverbal, of course. And this is really sort of a micro level, small scale, face-to-face type of situation, and that's why it fits into the symbolic interactionist perspective. So this is a micro level perspective, interactionist. So interactions take place in small scale, face-to-face settings, so we're on the micro level here. The symbolic interactionist perspective focuses on how people interact with each other to create the social world. So all of us, every day when we're having conversations, of course, we're just like grains of sand on a beach in sort of a metaphorical way if you think about society. But it all starts somewhere, and it starts with us, and it starts with our social interactions. And that's why it's important to sort of bring it down to this level to really understand sociology. The symbolic interactionist perspective is always going to be looking at social norms and standards that are created through social interactions. So how do we come to define what is understood as normal behavior? And really looking at how all of our communication occurs through symbols. The words that you see on a blackboard or that you're seeing on the screen right now, these are just symbols. They're just squiggles. We give them meaning. The words that you're hearing right now are just sounds, but you give them meaning, and we give it meaning through language. So that's, again, just sort of a small contribution with the symbolic interactionist perspective. So some of the key words are going to be things like interactions, symbols, meanings, labels, identities, gestures, everyday behavior, communication, experiences, all of these things that sort of occur on an everyday level are part of symbolic interactionism. So again, going back to our issue of poverty, how might a symbolic interactionist look at poverty? They would want to examine what it means to be poor. They would look at how we define poverty and what it means to be poor from the perspective of those who are labeled as poor. They ask, what labels do we assign the poor? This perspective looks at how poverty affects the way individuals act towards one another, and they ask, how do people behave towards poor individuals? So this again is going to be really contributory to those of you who are interested in, again, small-scale interactions, everyday behaviors, social norms, and how if we change those things, we can change even more about society. So some of our theorists in the symbolic interactionist perspective start with George Herbert Mead. So Mead said that we develop our sense of self through interacting with others and symbols. He thought that the root of society is the symbols that teach us to understand the world, like words, actions, text, etc. When we use these symbols, we develop a sense of self or an identity, and it's this identity that we take into the world and we interact with other identities and thus create society. So the building blocks of society are our minds, the place where we interpret symbols. We do this through micro interactions that we have every day, and it's never ending. For example, raising your hand in class has a meaning, that you have something to say and that you're waiting to be called on. So again, it's taking, a real, what's the word? It's taking sort of a microscope to the things that we take for granted and think are so normal, such as raising your hand. Herbert Bloomer also emphasized the importance of studying individual interactions with symbols and how we assign symbols meaning. He thought that humans behave toward things on the basis of their meanings that are derived from social interaction. He said that we react to things based on how we perceive them. We tailor our responses to the setting after we interpreted the reactions. So in a group setting, this can be different. We react without the same amount of thought. So he thought that group size had an influence on how we behave. He thought that when groups get excited, they behave more irrationally. So that meaning sort of takes on a new life. And the next person is Erving Goffman. So this is another one that I would encourage you to remember because we're going to talk about Erving Goffman throughout the semester. He's also a Canadian by birth, but most of his work took place in the United States. And his real contribution was this theory of dramaturgy. I know it's kind of a weird word, but the root word there being drama, he is talking about acting. So he said all of life is like acting and that we play different parts constantly all the time. So he thought that we are always trying to stay in character and manage how others perceive us based on the scenario that you're in. So he really thought that we always want to satisfy our audiences, and we're using our audiences to adjust our behavior based on whether we think that they're interpreting us well or not well. So for example, you're going to act differently in a job interview than you are on the weekend when you're hanging out with your friends. Your demeanor is going to be different and your audience is going to be different, so you'll behave differently. And again, we're going to talk about this later in the semester, but just to give you a little preview of dramaturgy and the fact that Goffman is a good one to remember. So one of the weaknesses of symbolic interactionism is that perhaps it ignores social structure, focusing too much on the individual. Some might say. All right, and our last theory, our question here being, does feminism include men? Why or why not? Take a minute, think about it. What do you think? So, sexism damages men in our society almost as much as it helps them. The gender role they're expected to conform to is one of emotional repression and violence. Although feminism is often thought of as a women's movement, men need feminism as well. How can we include men in the feminist movement while maintaining safe spaces for women? This is just one of the many, many, many thoughts that the feminist theory is going to contribute, not only in this class, but hopefully being more aware of it in pop culture as well. So the feminist perspective is interested in how gender affects inequality in society. It can be both micro and macro level in emphasis. So the feminist perspective goes both ways. It's often conflict-oriented, so it's very much overlaps with the conflict theory. However, the feminist perspective is going to specifically bring attention to an androcentric bias in society. which is how society is biased towards men, as well as within the school of sociology itself. So that's why the feminist perspective is so necessary. It's going to look back on some of these really old but classic studies in sociology that took place, 50, 100 years ago, but with only male subjects. So the conclusion that they came to really only suited men. So even within the discipline itself, it's important to raise questions about who our knowledge pertains to. And of course, there are a whole bunch of different types of feminism. Liberal feminists seek equality for all women, and radical feminists believe that patriarchy and capitalism are the root causes of inequality in women, and that, we shouldn't continue to have babies and reinforce this, yada, yada, yada. So there's all sorts of scales of feminism and different types. So just be aware of that if that interests you. So some of our key words for the feminist perspective here are going to be, of course, women and gender, roles, patriarchy, inequality, social constructions, class, race, age, orientation, ability, and how these things intersect, as well as the reinforcement of power. So an example of how the feminist perspective might approach our sample issue of poverty, feminists would focus on how poverty affects, of course, women in particular. They might look at how social structures and policies result in more women than men being poor. They would ask what changes would have to be made to the social, economic, and political systems in order to reduce the poverty of Canadian women. When we study poverty, do we focus on the homeless man, or do we consider the single mother who is struggling to barely make ends meet? And a direct issue that pertains to this that people talk about a lot is the wage gap. So the feminist perspective would be super interested in the wage gap in Canada and why it is, what we can do to correct it, and all that sort of stuff. Just a little reminder here that, feminism is important for all of us. It says, the thing is, it's patriarchy that says that men are stupid and monolithic and unchanging and incapable. It's patriarchy that says that men have animalistic instincts and just can't stop themselves from harassing and assaulting. It's patriarchy that says that men can only be attracted to certain qualities, can only have certain kinds of responses, and can only experience the world in narrow ways. Feminism holds that men are capable of more and are more than that. So, feminism, important for men too. Some of our very important feminist academics that you're introduced to in this chapter start with Harriet Martineau. She was the first female sociologist. That's why she's important. She wanted to increase justice and opportunity for women and pointed out the hypocrisy and favoritism in the U.S. at a time when it was unprecedented, especially for a woman to do so. So she fought for women as well as minorities. And then during a time when slavery existed, she was also working towards ending that as well. Dorothy Smith, also another influential Canadian sociologist. She's still alive as far as I know. So she's one of the most influential and well-known Canadian sociologists. She understands that culture is constructed, that we make it up. She was critical of sociology reflecting the male perspective, and she wanted to use stats and data that ignore subjectivity and personal experience and be able to incorporate that into the field of sociology, because she thought that this was sort of symbolic of patriarchy. Some may say the weaknesses of feminist theory are that they place too much emphasis on the impact of gender, but I mean, that kind of is what it is. Some may say that it lacks scientific validity and that it's too subjective. Sometimes subjective perspectives are necessary. All right, you should know that all four of these perspectives are interrelated in a lot of ways, and not all of them are going to be perfect for analyzing every single issue. You might want to use all four of them at certain times. You might have one that's your favorite. You might have one that you really just can't grasp, and that's okay. So they overlap, and they complement each other in a lot of ways. And out of all these theorists that we've talked about so far, there's one who gets his own page in the chapter, on page 22. You can pause this here. You can go right now and read about Max Weber. Starts with a W, but it's pronounced like a V. So Max Weber is the theorist who transcends categorization. And he's another person that we're going to talk about sort of throughout the semester because he had a lot of really important and groundbreaking sociological thoughts back in the day. Okay. Again, I'd like you to pause this right here and read over how all four of the perspectives might view another sort of sample issue of sports. So for those of you sports fans, you can wake up now. And I've got something interesting here for you. Again, this is from our old textbook, but I really like this example because, again, it's something that we think about all the time or maybe that you're interested in that can sort of demonstrate this very academic concept. All right, so when you come into class depends on when you're seeing this upload, but when you come back to class on May 23rd, we're going to do this activity right away. I'm going to break you up into groups, into 4 groups, and according to the theoretical perspectives, I want you to give me some points, give me some analysis on how your perspective might see the issue of sex work. So no need to worry about that just yet. I'll explain it all in class, just to sort of reinforce what each of the 4 sociological perspectives sort of emphasizes. And in the meantime, get working on your mission tasks on DC Connect. Read the chapter. It's kind of a long one, kind of a dense one, so I definitely encourage you to sort of sit down, read half, leave the other half for another day so that you're not too sort of exhausted and tired out by the content. I think that's a good strategy. But all right, I'm going to wrap this up now. You're probably tired of hearing my voice. I know I am. So thanks for listening, and if you have any questions, feel free to let me know. Otherwise, see you guys soon. Bye!